Okay, guys. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So I know that last week we did the reference shots for Rumpelstiltskin, and that's what I had been planning on doing. But I tried three different versions of the painting and didn't like any of them. So we are not doing that today. We are doing something else instead. So we are going to practice and experiment with landscape. And this is kind of impressionist landscape, but it is super fun because I'm going to be doing something a little different than usual. So usually what I'd like to do is paint wet in wet, meaning that if I plan to have a landscape with several layers, I will wet the paper first so that the background is blurry because then the paint will bleed into the wet background. But here I started with actually a dry paper and I am just, and this is very loose and experimental. I have no idea what I'm going to do here. I have no idea. I'm really just letting myself play and see what comes of it. So here I started off, as you can see, the tops of what look like trees, big pine trees is already kind of the suggestion that I'm going with. They are just onto dry paper. You can see the tops of them are very crisp. And I'm adding some color here, a little bit of purple. Whenever you do landscape, bear in mind, I think a lot of people, especially when they're starting out, forget about this, how much color is actually in a landscape. There are so many colors. And you do want colors when you're painting landscape that complement each other and go together. I really do like this color combination, sort of the color of, that bluish gray along with violet or purple and then like burnt sienna. These are, of course, Daniel Smith paints, and the blue, I believe, is called Kayasite blue. And then there's amethyst, which is the purple, of course. And then we've got some ochre. Here, I think I'm adding some burnt umber. And so, again, I'm just playing. I apologize for the glare on the paper. Actually, I also need to say that I've discovered recently that I'm pretty light sensitive, and don't do well when there are a lot of bright lights on the page. And that clearly affects the video quality. So I need to figure out what to do about that because I'm trying to find a soft lighting that I can bear while I'm drawing, but that also shows up for video. So here again, so you can see how loose it was, the background suggestion of those trees. And now I'm drawing more of the trees in the foreground. And as you can see, the closer we get to the foreground, the darker and more well-defined they're going to be. Again, with landscape painting, I think a lot of things, or one very simple thing to remember that helps a lot, is that, the background, the distance is going to be more faded and it is going to be lighter. And then the foreground is going to be darker and better defined. So here again, I'm just adding random shapes. I have no idea what I'm doing. Or what I'm planning. I mean, I'm not planning anything specific. I'm obviously, these look like trees to me, so that's what I'm going with. I'm doing some trees. I am adding all kinds of different colors. I'm bringing a lot of the darker colors into the foreground. I'm playing with a page that is not completely saturated wet, but there's enough wetness so that when I do these really defined shapes like this, there's a little bit of bleed, but not much. So as you can see how simple it was as I went up there doing the pines. It was a very quick, simple process, just kind of like getting the leaves in there and having them rise up like that. I'm liking how in the background there's those towering pine trees that kind of just add this nice sort of cloudy, lofty feeling to the whole thing. Okay, so I'm adding, and it's looking more and more like this is kind of a, obviously the edge of a tree line, a forest line. I'm bringing some dark blue, some dark purples into the front and letting it bleed down a bit, obviously. So let's just see what happens here. I'm defining that tree line a little more. I'm adding some water. This is a really good brush. I'll link the brush down below. But this brush is actually, I've always kind of shied away from larger brushes for very defined work, which was a mistake. I'm seeing this is a really good brush for very defined work and for larger surface work. It just holds its point very nicely. So I'm bringing up this other tree with some more burnt sienna. And okay, so here I'm feeling like I really want to add some more definition again to the background. So I go back in with that blue, which is one of the Daniel Smith Primatech colors. So it has this amazing granulation, as you can see. So I'm blotting some of that out, adding some water to soften it again while keeping a bit more of that defined edge, because I know it's just going to dry and it's going to fade. So I felt that was safe to do. Adding a little more definition there in the background. I'm liking how it's looking so far. Very loose, very impressionistic, very faded. And I know soon that I'm going to have to define things even more if I want a scene that actually resembles anything at all. So you can see I'm wetting a lot of the page, getting an even wetter. And then soon the fun part starts. Okay, so here I'm getting more specific. It's already drying a bit, so I'm able to do this with a lot less bleed. And you'll start to notice, so this is going to get super fun in a second. You'll start to notice that when I drag the semi-wet brush through, or when I drag the dry brush through the semi-wet paint, so look there, it creates this really amazing effect where it looks like a tree trunk. So essentially, I'm just dragging the brush without any paint on it or just a little bit of water through the existing shapes that I have. So I sort of drew the suggestion of tree trunks just by having, just by doing these sort of long streak or strokes of color, these long vertical strokes of color. And then when I go back in, when the paint is semi-dry or drying, and drag it through, it's going to create these trunks. And I'm going to be doing a lot more of that in a second. And it really, really creates, like, there we go. And this brush does it a little bit, but then I start using a different brush in a moment that is even better for that. So see, it's already looking more like trunks, and I'm not adding any color. I'm not, adding anything other than using the brush itself to help me out with this. And I know that I'm going to have some trees in the foreground. So here it's looking like this could be a scene at the edge of a river, is what this is resembling to me. So I'm doing the same thing. I'm going in with a brush. Here is where I start using, honestly, this is a very sort of crappy old brush. It is not a fancy brush at all. I think it was incredibly cheap. I've used it for acrylics and for oils, meaning that it is harder and more bristly. But with it, when I just wet it, I'm able to go in and create this sort of stream appearance. That there's a little brook going through the edge of this sort of forest, this tree line. And this brush was incredibly effective for that technique where I'm creating these tree trunks, as you can see. So see, I'm just going up with the brush. I'm letting it do its thing, not adding any color at all. Just here I did add a little bit of color, a little bit of burnt sienna. But primarily what I use this brush for is to create those shapes along the edge there. So I'm trying to define things. I'm trying to make it obvious that I'm creating a stream appearance. And so this is where it gets so super fun, guys. So the paint has dried enough that now it's very successful when I drag it up to create those trees. So now we're sort of starting to see what this is, especially there on the right-hand side. I know that that tree that is closest to us on the closer, on It's between us and where the little creek is. I'm going to have to define that a lot more to make it clear that it's in the foreground, that it's close to us. Here I got kind of brave, added some really dark amethyst in there, seeing if it works. Usually I wouldn't add something quite that dark to something I want to portray as being further away, but I felt for this picture, it would just be nice to have some amethyst there. So see, here we go. Here the paint is at the perfect dryness where it's allowing for these great grand high pines to be created. And anyone can do this. This is such a super easy technique. It really is. If you go back through this sort of step by step and try to imitate it, it is really just kind of blotching a bunch of paint. I mean, I am using good quality paint and good quality paper, and I think honestly the paper might even matter more here. This is cold press. It's 140-pound Arches cold press paper, which is usually what I use. And it has enough tooth to allow me to do this. And I'm very curious actually how something like this would be on hot press paper, because hot press is so smooth and you get such clear defined edges compared to rough and cold press sometimes, that I think this might be even more effective on hot press. So I think I'm actually going to experiment with that at some point soon and see how that goes. But here, so I'm defining this large, huge pine. I really miss these kinds of trees. Not that I ever really grew up with them. These are sort of the Pacific Northwest types of enormous pines. But I feel an affinity for them. I like them. So here I'm making this one closer to me, meaning I need to make it darker, more well-defined, while trying to keep the abstract feel of this picture in general. So I don't want to ruin the abstract feel of the picture in general. I want to keep that while making it obvious that this tree is in the foreground. So I'm just defining the tops of them. And I really exclusively at this point am using that old kind of crappy bristly brush. So if you essentially blob a bunch of paint onto your paper and play with it, mix it around, get a color combination you like, get the vague suggestions of shapes that you're looking for. Trees are a perfect thing. An organic form like trees are perfect things to experiment with. Rocks would be as well, maybe water, just because there are so many different ways to paint and portray each of those things. And trees have no single defined shape. So you can play with it a lot when it comes to impressions. So trees are good to practice with. But then, try different experiments in terms of how to create foliage, how to create tree trunks. There are so many different ways. This is just one of them that I personally love and find effective. And I honestly didn't even know for sure that that's the route I was going to go when I started this. But once I sort of saw the little stream going through there, I recognized that that would probably be the most effective way to kind of show and portray this little scene here. So one thing that myself and all watercolorists have to watch out for quite a lot is to avoid overpainting, meaning you just need to learn to let well enough alone. So a lot of times we'll have something that's working, and I don't know what it is in us that we can't just stop and let it rest, but we keep going and going and going. And it really is best to just leave it. So at this point, I felt pretty confident that I still had stuff left to define in this picture. But I could have stopped. It's very interesting. I mean, some artists would have stopped about 10 steps ago and said, that's good enough for me. I have the vague suggestion of trees. I don't need to define them anymore. I want to keep it as loose and impressionistic as I was back then. That's fine. I generally tend to favor loose and impressionistic when it comes to landscape far more than well-defined. So I was really trying to be careful as I went on with this to retain that feel of looseness while also defining the trees. But again, it's just so much fun. It was so much fun. I just couldn't stop. I love when paint is at this stage and you just drag a brush through it and it'll do what you want and create these incredible effects. And I really did want this to sort of have the feeling of a dream, of walking into a dream. That is my favorite kind of landscape, is a landscape that's evocative and calls forth, you know, just sort of lingering on the edges of reality is really my favorite thing. So that's what I was hoping to evoke with this once it started to look like an actual image to me. So I'm realizing also that here on the right, I'm going to have to define these trees a lot better since I've now defined some of the trees that are even further away. I'm definitely going to have to do that with the trees that are closer. So again, just using my crappy little brush, pulling it up through the paint. Again, as the paint dries more and more, it creates slightly different effects. The trunks are now much lighter. It's easier to create those. See, and I'm just delighted at what it is doing. This ancient pine forest that the viewer can just wander into and see. And again, I really do love these colors, that they're sort of fall, but there's also so much blue and purple in there. And I do think the type of watercolor paper really matters. We'll do this again with hot press, and we'll see how this technique looks with hot press paper. Again, I have a feeling it's going to look really, really cool. I can't believe I haven't tried this before on hot press because I don't usually use hot press, but it's got so many virtues, guys. So many effects can come from hot press paper that we just don't think about if you don't usually use it. Okay, so I'm defining the trees up by the edge of this little stream more and more. I think one of my dreams in life is to own like a log cabin in an utterly remote place like this, just by a stream in a pine forest. And so yeah, I've defined more and more of these little trunks. Here I'm nearing the stage where I'm wondering, okay, do I need to stop soon? When do I need to stop? Like I'm really wanting to make sure I do right by the page or by the picture and not go too crazy with it. So I'm getting close. I'm getting close to wanting to leave it alone. I'm starting to wonder at this point if I should have left the blue trees in the background, if I should have painted them wet on wet and had them fade. It's hard to know. It is a very well-defined background, far better defined than I usually have. So I'm just thinking about it, wondering. And I do experiment with that a little bit later and use gouache to blot it out. And then I kind of bring it back because I ended up liking it. So here I am just defining these trees in the front a little more. And I'm really liking the effect. I'm really liking how quick this was. This is sped up twice. So you watching this, it took twice that long, but under an hour. Very short. Really the biggest component here, honestly, is letting the paint dry enough so that you can drag a bristly brush through it. And I actually think, you know what, I think I'm going to leave this alone. I think I'm pretty much done. I like it. I don't want to overdo it. Just doing a few little last minute touches and then, so here's what it looks like. I left it alone. And you know, well, I did leave it alone, but I also didn't leave it alone, and you'll see what I mean. So I have this version, and then I played with it a little bit with gouache, and I took out some of the background. So that's what it looks like with the background taken out. So I have both versions for sure. Both versions exist. Which I'm glad about. It's interesting because this version, you know, I really don't know if I like it any better. It does definitely bring out these trees, obviously, in the foreground, but we'll see. We'll keep playing with it. If you like what you saw, please like and subscribe. Thanks so much, guys, and I will see you next week. Bye.